Less than 4 years remain until 2030. That's the deadline for sustainable development goals set by countries worldwide. Governments, scientists and communities have committed to ambitious targets, from limiting global temperature rise under the Paris Agreement to protecting at least 30% of Earth's land and oceans under global biodiversity framework. But despite these commitments, data suggests that we are far from where we need to be. Protected areas cover only a fraction of the target. Funding gaps are measured in hundreds of billions each year, and nature-based solutions remain dramatically underfunded. On today's episode of Insight, we are speaking on this matter with Dr. Maheshwar Dhakal, Joint Secretary in Nepal government. He holds a PhD in environmental science and currently leads the climate change division. Dr. Dhakal, welcome to NTV World Insight.
Thank you very much.
The data that I could access, the latest one that I could access, showed that only about 17.6% of terrestrial areas and 8.5% of oceans are protected. That is far below the 30% target by 2030. Do you think this gap is large, and if so, what does it mean for biodiversity and climate resilience worldwide?
You are very much clear that the 30% target by 2030 is a very ambitious target. Let's compare in two levels, at a global level and our country context. In the beginning, in 2010, when COP10 was decided, 2020 targets in Aichi in Japan, at that time the target what we set, we means all the parties of CBT conventions, but unfortunately none of the parties they achieved the targets. But on the other hand, if you compare to Nepal, already Nepal has 23% of the port area coverage, right? But when this result was discussed in 2015, it's called Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, which is the 15th COP in Canada, and international communities they agreed again to reach the level of 30-30 target, but with some flexible mechanisms. It's called OECD, other environmental conservation measure. It's the very flexible modality, unlike the port area and wildlife reserve or hunting reserves. It's together with the local communities and with assurance of the rights of the local communities. Different mechanism we proposed, and government of Nepal also agreed to that mechanism, and we already initiated one strategy regarding to the OECD. If you compare more specifically, we do have a couple of areas where we have to conserve it. For example, I would like to give the very visible example is Godavari forest area, which is very intact in terms of biodiversity conservation, but yet to be decided none of the port area systems. And government of Nepal, particularly our Ministry of Forest and Environment, we declare is the conservation of forest is the one of the mechanism under the forest law. There are a couple of areas across the country in Nepal. If you go eastern region, the Tinjure Milke Jaljali, the Laligruas area is one of the best area to declare another port area, and at the same time if you go to the Panchase is interconnected with Sengja, Kanski and Parvat, and similarly if you go to the more lowland, the Dhankhola area, Kapilpasto, Dang and Argakhachi, and at the same time Jogbuda and some of the Limi Valley in the high mountains region in Humla. These are the some areas we can declare it's a special category of the port area management. In your questions, if you compare to Nepal, Nepal is pretty comfortable positions to reach that target, but if you compare to the global scales, then definitely there are some still challenges, because the very short answer and very quick point is most of the developed countries and some developing countries, they are not very much encouraging or motivating to declare new port area system, but at the same time for public consumptions they used to speak in the public forum, but at country levels they are not very much interested. That is the situation. just 4 years is remaining to reach to this target, right? But if we adopt, we means all the parties, convention parties adopted the OECM mechanism, then I am hopeful that the global community can reach the target.
When we talk of climate change and biodiversity, we often treat them as separate issues. Is this one crisis or two?
You mean the climate change and biodiversity?
Yes. Yeah. Even with UN, there are separate conferences.
I think, it's very nice question. If you go by 1992, when Rio Convention was held in Brazil, at that time 3 conventions were declared at the same time, at the same place. They are the climate change, biodiversity and desertifications. But if you go through the process of implementations, then climate change is implementing more aggressively. Sometimes the part of climate justice is coming very prominently, and forefront agenda is considered by many communities. On the other hand, biodiversity parties also looks very nice, because most of the countries, they are doing their best job, but desertification, maybe very few countries are highly impacted from the desertification. That's why this convention is discussed very little in the international arena. But in my opinion, these 3 conventions are interconnected and interrelated each other to save the environment and protect the planet. They are interconnected.
Now, countries have been part of frameworks like the Paris Agreement and also Global Biodiversity Framework. Many countries, including Nepal, have also declared nationally determined contributions, NDCs. But are we on track to achieve all the targets in the document, or are these just symbolic steps?
I think, as I am leading the climate change division, then definitely we are very much committed, and we are working to achieve those targets which are we set in the NDC. But at the same time, it is really hard if we do not secure the sufficient funding resources. That's why if you go through our NDC, we are giving the 2 types of targets. One is the conditional one, and another is unconditional one. Unconditional one, definitely we will achieve, because our resources, our capacity and our policy, all supporting factors, enabling environments we will create. But on the other hand, the conditional one is we are asking to the international community that Nepal is a landlocked, developing, mountainous country, and we are emitted very little carbon emissions, but we are affected most. That's why we need support from the international community to build our adaptation capacity. That's why most of the target, particularly energy target, the hydropower and other clean energy targets, we are expecting some support from the international community to achieve those targets. Because the reason behind this, Nepal, we do not have petroleum products and fossil fuels. Our production we do not have, right? But on the other hand, we are importing those resources. We would like to promote the clean energy and replace the fossil fuels and contribute the global carbon emission reduction process. But on the other hand, clean energy will create the multiple jobs and opportunities to our communities. Even our target is to sell those energy to our neighbor countries and to support them as well.
The US government back in 2015 as well, and after the latest takeover by US President Donald Trump, withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Do you think steps like these influence the global effort towards building resilience towards climate change and our climate activities?
I think it's a very diplomatic one, but it is the internal matter of United States, if you ask to me, it's officially. But at the same time, United States is the major partner and pillar to the international process, and I do hope that sooner or later the United States will be with the process. But many people and many communities, many countries, they are doubt how the future discourse, debate and the pathway of the climate change and biodiversity will go. It's really unclear and questionable, and we have to wait sometimes.
You also mentioned just now about the funding gap that we have in implementing our NDC targets, achieving the NDC targets in fact. And the global recent analysis suggests that we're spending trillions in global economy that is against nature, while our climate actions and climate activities are only worth around billions of dollars. So there's a huge gap in there. What do you think needs to change in how global finance is aligned to truly support conservation and climate goals?
Yeah, definitely. While we are talking about the climate finance or biodiversity finance, basically we discuss our negotiations based on the two parameters. The one is need base, how much amount of money is expected in the NDC and adaptation plan, including the biodiversity NVSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, those national policy documents. On the other hand, the science recommendation, particularly in climate change, IPCC recommends how much money it needs and to implement those activities. On the other hand, IPBES is the recommendation for the biodiversity conservations. You are rightly pointed out that we need a huge amount of money to implement and to achieve those NDC targets and biodiversity targets, but the global communities are not in the position to support by providing funding resources. This is the big challenges. That's why our negotiation process, and we are discussing with the developed countries that if you see the last 200 years, most of the developed countries, they enjoy with the natural resources and they develop their infrastructure, and with the recent all the development facilities or commodities whatever used by the developed countries, and they benefited a lot. But unfortunately, most of the developing countries are impacted from the climate change or biodiversity loss or even air pollution. That's why this is a part of justice. Then how do we developing countries, and particularly like-minded countries including Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, even India and China, how we unite each other and claim the climate finance, and also convince to the developed countries to pledge as much as money that we need. That's why we need a very collective and very collaborative approach. If you remember, last year we organized Sagarmatha Samvad, and it's a coincidence that I was the member secretary for the Sagarmatha Samvad as well, right? And our understanding and our conclusion is, unless and until if we do not promote a regional approach, particularly for South Asia, then we cannot achieve the sufficient resource funding. That's why global and the regional partnership approach we have to develop to secure sufficient funding resources. But if you are talking if global scale, then definitely all the developing countries, including least developed country like Nepal and SIDS, small island developing countries, we have to discuss together, and we have to develop our science strong enough as we need, because without very sufficient information, sufficient science, then simply asking money for climate justice, no one is going to pledge. That's why we have to develop our capacity in terms of science, in terms of evidence, and then we have to claim. Otherwise, it's really impossible to get those huge resources that we need.
Mountain agenda has been on the table during COPs from countries like Nepal and small island nations as well. How is the progress been so far? Have we made strides when it comes to locking these resources that we're talking about?
Yes, definitely. This year we organized Sagarmatha Samvad. This year means last year. And the conclusion of the Sagarmatha Samvad was very much clear, and we are asking to the international community, if you save the mountains, then you can save the downstream communities, or if you do not save or do not protect the mountains, then definitely the downstream communities will face the climate induced disasters, including landslides, floods and inundations and so on. mountain agenda is really important for us. Is we are the leading country, not only the Mountain Everest, so whole country is a mountainous country. And this time in COP30, we discuss, we negotiate, and we coordinated all the like-minded countries and similar organizations, even experts, and even head of the institutions. And finally, the COP30 is decided to hold a global dialogue on mountain and climate change in coming June in Bonn, Germany, and Nepal is also preparing on it. We do have a very clear two agenda on this mountain part. One is we are asking the international community to recognize mountain is the separate agenda to the UNFCCC negotiation process, so that we can discuss a couple of issues under the mountain agenda: local communities, indigenous people, our culture, and then nature-based tourism, medicinal plants, forest, biodiversity, everything. So we can discuss over the mountain agenda. And then second, what we are asking to the international community is the lives and livelihoods of the mountainous communities is really very difficult, and the livelihood is, the hardship of the livelihood is really different and unique in the mountainous countries like Nepal, and therefore we need to discuss every year as an annual dialogue. Sometimes we do not like to exaggerate, unnecessarily exaggerate about the mountains, but what is reality in the ground, you have to understand. That part we are going to discuss and negotiate to the international communities, and hopefully in coming June we will discuss, but at the same time we have to convince to all international communities together, because it's the global phenomena. Sometimes the personally or individual country can put their agenda, but how and whether you can convince to the international communities or not, that is really important.
When you mention of the impacts of climate change, when you talk about livelihoods and culture, there is a clear dissection that we tend to evaluate more about the tangible impacts of climate change and not the intangible, maybe. Do you think the two are weighed equally?
Most of the climate change negotiator, and even including myself in the past, we discuss about half of the negotiations. So what I used to say, carbon emission, glacier melting, glove, and all the cascading effects in the downstreams. This is the one part. But on the other hand, most of the mountainous countries, and particularly Nepalese mountainous countries, they protect the forest and biodiversity, and they preserve the glacier in the top of the mountain, right? As a result, you are getting the fresh water, and huge amount of carbon is sink in the mountains, and they have huge contributions to protect the planet and regulate the climate. That's why they have to be compensated through mechanism of environmental services, or you can say simply the innovative financial mechanism. That's why what we are asking to the international communities is, if we do not support or compensate to the mountainous communities, otherwise they are not going to protect those forests and biodiversity, and many, not only many, billions of the people in the downstream, they are going to face the water security problem.
Now, as we talk about climate injustice, countries like Nepal are least polluter but are the most impacted. From a global justice perspective, what do you think must change in the international system to ensure effective conservation and climate action?
Yes, being Nepal is the less emitter and the most impacted country, is a part of climate justice. Then we have to ask to the international communities to support us or to build our capacity to cope those crises, or build the adaptation capacity. Even nowadays, what we are discussing about the loss and damage under the climate change framework, we need the additional finance, and we have to increase our access over the advanced technology, and we also need some capacity building activities, including those people who are living far from the city center and really impacted in the ground, including children, youth, even women, senior citizen. Even nowadays, if you go to the remote areas of Nepal, most of the senior citizens, they are the most affected. That's why we need a climate justice for them, and to make their ability or capacity to cope those climate crisis.
You've been part of many COPs on behalf of Nepal government. What is the mood in the room like? Do you think developed countries are committed to helping countries like ours?
Yeah, do you know, if you ask me very honestly, the present international geopolitics is rapidly and drastically changing, and then it's very difficult to predict what will be happen tomorrow. But I'm pretty confident that sooner or later the developed countries should be responsible, because they are the reason behind this crisis.
Ecosystems, species migrations and climate impacts transcend national borders, of course.
Yeah.
In your observation, what global or regional cooperation mechanisms have been most promising, and where do you see gaps that need urgent attention?
I think there are two parts in your questions. If you are asking me about the biodiversity and the migration of the wild species, including wildlife, this is the one part. But on the other hand, because of the climate change and biodiversity loss, the human migrations is also taking place so rapidly. Even nowadays, people are migrating from rural area to city areas, and city areas to capital areas, and capital areas to international, right? That's why what we are asking to the policymaker or politician is develop the city planning and the climate change adaptation capacity of the local communities to provide maximum climate change adaptation activities to them. But migration is nowadays is so rapidly taking place. That's why it's very difficult to manage it, because other externalities also coming together. That's why we have to think more comprehensive and more integrated approach, so that we can retain our youth to the rural area or city areas. But climate resilient city planning is the most to retain those communities. But at the same time, we have to seek for maximum and multiple employment and job opportunities to the youth. Otherwise, it's really hard to make the stable community and stable society.
Now, Nepal has seen a substantial and very encouraging forest cover rise, which is around 46% of its land. And we also maintain roughly 23% of the territory as protected areas. Do you see this conservation model particularly as an example that the world can learn from?
Yes, definitely we are in the right direction, but we have to departure now, because in the beginning, if you see 1970s, our conservation modality was started through the wilderness theory, means keep intact the ecosystems and do not damage or do not hamper anymore. But later on, what we realize is state-led one-side conservations or intact of the ecosystem is not enough unless local communities are integrated with the system. That we realize. That's why we introduce participatory approach, both in community forestry and then buffer zone based participatory approach. But from the last 30 to 40 years experience, we protected our forests so well, including with local communities and with very good participation, even the women and youth and every segment of the society we incorporated with the system. But unfortunately, we do not make a very clear plan what we will do next once the forest is protected or preserved, right? And in my expert view, this is the right time to welcome, to integrate the private sectors and harvest forest as a renewable natural resources and create more enabling environment to the private sector and process the maximum and multiple goods and services based on the forest and biodiversity enterprises and sell to the market, even not only the Nepalese one, even beyond international markets, and earn maximum foreign exchange and create job and opportunities. These are the good opportunities. That's why in summary, we are in the right directions, but this is the time to capitalize, to monetize our resources.
The prospect that you just mentioned about creating job opportunities and economic growth by utilizing our forest resources, do you think our existing policies facilitate that?
Yes, of course, our policies are supporting, but sometimes I am also observing that not enough as private sector is expecting. That's why simplify the process and very clear mechanism as expected by the private sector. I think it's a time to revisit our policy together with private sector and experts from the conservation sides. Ultimately, to make our country prosperous is our responsibility. That's why conservation or protection of the forest and development are not a blaming games, and it's a trade-off, and we have to sit together and find the win-win approach that both conservation and development can together parallelly and respect each other. This is the way what I'm thinking here.
Dr. Dhakal, lastly, what for you would be a successful global conservation and climate architecture look like by 2030, as we also are reaching a deadline for SDGs?
Yes, not only SDGs, even there are a couple of other targets also going to finish by 2030. Unfortunately, the international politics looks a little bit unstable at this moment. That's why it is really hard to say more quantitatively. But at the same time, the global communities with very, very advanced science, the human activities are becoming more efficient and more comfortable, because nowadays each and every information you can take from anywhere of the planet, of the world. That's why this is the opportunity. But at the same time, sincere and disciplined society is really looking very challengeable. This morning I read one paper that this is the time to redefine the international geopolitics. That's why coming 4 years really challenging for me as a policy maker of the developing countries. Just I have an option to be hopeful and do our best as much as possible to contribute the process. But it's really hard to achieve those targets by 2030.
Thank you so much for being on NTV World Insight.
Thank you very much.
Well, climate and conservation progress looks uneven at present. However, inspiring examples from around the world, including Nepal, we hope show that change is possible through collaboration. We hope today's conversation adds to the global discourse on turning ambition into tangible impact, ensuring that future generations inherit a planet that is resilient, thriving, and full of life. Thank you for staying with us here on NTV World Insight. Until next time.